Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask, what are the prospects for constitutional reform in the UK? What options are on the government's agenda? What might actually happen? And will any such changes be adequate for resolving underlying problems? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Politics in the UK has in recent years been pretty tempestuous. Brexit, COVID, movements to break up the UK, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, prime ministers who seemed to disrespect the rules, most recently the ructions caused by Donald Trump's return to the White House. All of these pressures and others have stretched political norms, sometimes close to breaking point. They have also raised many questions about how the core institutions of the UK's political system function and whether reforms are needed. So constitutional change is on the table. But what options are on the agenda? How likely are they to pass? And would they resolve the problems that have been exposed? Well, a new report exploring such questions has just been published by the UCL Constitution Unit, which specialises in research aimed at informing debate on constitutional change. Two of the report's authors join me now. They are Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit and Professor of British and Comparative Politics in the UCL Department of Political Science, and Lisa James, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Constitution Unit. Meg and Lisa, welcome back, both of you, to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to have you on again. And I should also mention before we get going that I'm in a slightly unusual position today because I'm also one of the authors of this report. So alongside us asking the questions, I'll be maybe chipping in a few thoughts as we go along as well. But before we get into the details of the report, let's maybe set the scene a bit. And Meg, some of our listeners may be surprised by the idea that the UK has a constitution at all. It's often said by people that the UK is a country that doesn't have a constitution. When we're talking about this thing, the UK constitution, what kind of thing should listeners have in mind? How would you characterise the nature of the UK constitution?
Thanks, Alan, and it's good to be here. I would say all democracies have a constitution, and indeed many non-democracies also have a constitution. But the UK constitution is an unusual one. It's a sort of famously unusual one for being one of the few in the world that doesn't have its central rules written down in a single document. In constitutions, basically describe the rules of the game, the relationships between different key institutions and how the system works, the system within which we do politics. And many countries do write that down in a document so that people can go and look up their rules. And we don't do that here. Our constitution is unusual not only for not being written, but also a key word is codified. It's not codified. So when you have one of these documents, generally it's a document which is harder to amend than ordinary law. So you have some sort of special process for constitutional amendment, which makes it quite sort of rigid. So we have a constitution, we have a whole set of rules, but they're scattered around in different places. Some of them are in law, some of them are in guidance or documents which don't have legal status, and some of them are just in convention. Now, all countries have a degree of that. So even those that famously have written constitutions have a lot of aspects of the constitution and its interpretation that aren't written down. If you look at this report, which we'll come on to discuss in more detail, it covers a lot of different topics, some of which would be written down in a constitution in another country. So things like the membership of the second chamber, the relationship between the central government and the sub-national governments, how those powers are distributed, the franchise, who's allowed to vote, those kinds of things you would normally find in a constitutional document. But it also discusses a lot of other things. I mean, people might be surprised to know that the electoral system often isn't stated in a written constitution. And then there are lots of other things which are sort of lower level things, like the rules for lobbying or the use of deliberative democracy. And we discuss all of these things in the report. So the fact that the UK constitution is an uncodified constitution means that it is famously flexible. It's easier to change than typical written constitutions. And I think that one of the one of the consequences of that is that we are, as a country, rather constantly engaged in a discussion about our constitution, what should change next. So this report covers 31 different topics. We're always having these kinds of conversations, and the question is what's on the agenda now for this government and what might change next.
That's really helpful, thank you. So that sets out both the scope of this document and the fact that it is very broad. It includes many aspects of the rules and the conventions often through which the governing institutions in the UK function. But it also tells us something about the nature of debate about constitutional reform in the UK. And as you say, that's a very continuous process. And also, I guess, constitutional reform itself is just easier to happen in the UK than in many other countries. Thinking about the state of debate around the Constitution in the UK, Lisa, this has been, as I hinted at in the introduction there, a fairly vexed area over recent years. There have been various different constitutional controversies. What would you say have been the main controversies that shape the current debates about possible constitutional reforms?
Well, I think if we look back over the last decade, there are two really big events that really kind of brought to the fore some of the long-running conversations and tensions that Meg referred to that have always existed in the Constitution but are rarely at the front of people's minds. And those two events were, of course, first the Brexit period and then the COVID pandemic. And both of those engage some of the really big questions about how the core constitutional actors in the UK relate to one another. So listeners may well remember the very vexed period of 2019 in particular, as the government and Parliament fought it out to decide who was going to be responsible for creating and approving Brexit policy. Some of those questions came back in relation to pandemic regulations, when there was a lot of debate about what was the appropriate balance of government flexibility in deciding how to respond to a public health emergency and parliamentary oversight of what restrictions were being put on people's lives. And both those periods also engaged various other areas of constitutional debate, devolution in particular, the repatriation of policy areas that had been managed at EU level, and then again the policy response to the pandemic, both raised really, really difficult questions about how powers and responsibilities should be balanced between UK level and the devolved administrations. And there were really competing arguments on both sides about how you both respond to the democratic aspects of devolution and ensuring that people in devolved administrations have an appropriate voice and are allowed to make their own policy decisions, and also how you make sure that the UK as a state responds to things in a sort of coherent and joined up way. And that's a debate that's ongoing to this day. And then, of course, in recent years, we've seen quite a lot of tension at times between the government and the courts. And that brings us into tricky areas about things like how judicial review should be managed, but also debates about the role of political discourse and how we make sure that we have these conversations in a sort of constructive fashion.
And just picking up on that last point, Meg, something that you've written about a fair bit over these years has been around the quality of standards in public life and the concerns that, particularly during the premiership of Boris Johnson, those standards were not being adequately upheld.
Yeah, well, I think that going back to what I was saying about where a constitution resides, whether it's in a codified document or in statute or in convention, there were pressures on some of the formal rules, and indeed the Conservative Manifesto of 2019 suggested that there needed to be a reconsideration of the relationship between Parliament, the government and the courts. But a lot of the concerns in that period were not about hard rules, they were about adherence to norms of good behaviour, whether we are anymore, as Peter Hennessy famously put it, good chaps, whether we can rely on people to behave well, or whether we need to constrain them further. And I think we, obviously during the Johnson period, we also saw the parties in Number 10 during lockdown, and there was a lot of concern about sort of standards of decency slipping. I would also add, because I think Lisa didn't mention them during the Johnson period, major controversies about when Parliament sits and when it doesn't, both in terms of his prorogation of Parliament that was ruled unlawful in the Supreme Court, thereby stoking those tensions between government, Parliament and the courts, but also the dissolution of Parliament. These are both things that there are sections on in the report about the circumstances in which it should be possible to dissolve Parliament and hold a general election, because there was a big fight between Johnson and Parliament regarding whether he was allowed to call an early election in 2019 because of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which he subsequently got rid of. So there were an awful lot of controversies over that period. Another thing that I've written about is standards of legislative scrutiny, which came up during that period as well and is discussed in the report.
Yeah. And just to add further to this litany of woe, I guess I would also point out that the public have noticed these problems, and the public are deeply disaffected with the state of democracy in the UK. You know, we can see that in terms of the opinion polls, but we can also see it with very low turnout at the last election, exceptionally, historically low levels of support for the two main historical political parties, people really feeling alienated from the political system. And of course, you know, concerns around misinformation, disinformation, interference from malign actors, the potential for big money to subvert the democratic process, the looming possibilities of AI coming in and how that might influence democracy as well. So lots of concerns about the kind of health of the democratic process underlying a lot of these concerns. Good. So there are many, many issues that many people are concerned about that might deserve attention to be given to the institutions and possible constitutional reforms. And this Constitution Unit report seeks to offer an intervention in these debates. What's the purpose of the report? What fundamentally is it trying to do in this context? Lisa, do you want to pick that up?
Sure. So the report is essentially seeking to provide an accessible, concise guide to the current state of affairs in various areas of the Constitution, and also to point to what might be done if you wanted to strengthen in various areas. So our starting point is that we're still relatively near the beginning of a new Parliament. We are, as I mentioned here, emerging from a period in which there's been a lot of very high-profile constitutional controversy, and I think that creates a good moment to stop and take stock. We've tried to do that in a very accessible way. The Constitution is a sort of sprawling and complicated thing at times. And so the report is quite simply structured into sort of 31 standalone sections so that people can hopefully dip in and find the things they're most interested in.
So 31 different bits of the constitutional framework, if you like.
Indeed. Across sort of 6 broad areas. Mm-hmm. And what we've tried to do...
just want to tell us what those broad areas are?
Yeah, of course. So Parliament, of course, government, the royal prerogative, which is a bit of jargon, and that's sort of powers officially held by the monarch but really exercised by the government on its behalf. Devolution and the future of the Union, elections and public participation, and law, justice and the courts. So it's quite a wide-ranging document. And our aim for each of these things, as I mentioned, has been to lay out essentially what is the current state of affairs, and then to talk about the work that's already been done to identify potential reforms. And in some areas, there's really quite clear agreement between kind of parliamentary committees, expert bodies, about what you would do in those areas if you wanted to make changes. So we may come on to talk about ministerial standards. There's a fairly clear set of potential reforms around that. In some others, we might take civil service reform as an example. It's relatively clear what the problems are, but it's much harder to come to a single set of solutions on which everyone would agree. And we've tried to be quite open about where there is consensus and where actually there are lots of different options that you would need to take into consideration.
And I think there are other areas beyond that where there isn't agreement on what the problem is. If you take the future of the Union, the SNP want to break the Union up and want Scotland to be independent, and there are other people who are very firmly opposed to that. And so there's quite a lot of conflict on some of these areas as well. I mean, I would say that the Constitution Unit always seeks to provide an impartial and objective voice, which is very evidence-based on these matters. So I hope that this is a useful guide for people who are less familiar with some of these topics, or who just want to dip in and wonder what's going on some of these individual topics, to very quickly get an idea of what the position of the government might be based on its manifesto, what some of the events of recent years have been, but also to provide the evidence. There's a lot of references in the report to much more detailed reports of other expert bodies, parliamentary committees and so on. So if you really want to gen up on one of these areas, it's a place to go to kind of work out what the lay of the land is, and to recommend you lots of further reading. It follows up a report that we did back in 2023, where we looked across what the sort of range of topics were that a new government might look at. And this is trying to go into more detail to provide people with a bit more of that background so they can get into these things area by area.
And Meg mentioned there the Labour manifesto. I guess it would be useful, before we go into the detail of some of the parts of the report, to just get a sense overall of how much constitutional reform actually is an important issue on the government's agenda at the moment. If we think back to the last Labour government coming to power in 1997, it came to power with a very extensive and ambitious programme of reform on the Constitution. Do we see anything comparable to that in the present government? Lisa?
So Labour did come to power last year with some stated ambitions on the Constitution. Obviously, the election itself was not fought on constitutional policy issues. Elections very, very rarely are. But if you look at the manifesto, there were some fairly clear ambitions for reform. And I think even looking beyond that, something that people may well recall from the campaign is a sort of a stated ambition to do politics differently and to do politics better, what Keir Starmer often talked about as the sort of politics of service, and an attempt to draw quite a clear dividing line between what Labour was very keen to present as a sort of a public service-oriented party compared to what they would have seen as a sort of scandal-ridden Tory government. And so that there was a sort of a rhetorical divide there quite clearly. But there were some concrete constitutional policies in the manifesto. Some of the most eye-catching perhaps in the area of elections, with the pledge to introduce votes at 16. Also in devolution, there was a very clear ambition, which the government is currently acting on, and we talk about this a bit more in the report, to extend devolution settlements in England, to look at the combined authority model, but also in some other areas. So Lords reform was very clearly in there, and that's one of the areas where there was some detail. The removal of the remaining hereditaries, so the 92 hereditary peers who were retained when most of their fellows left under the last Labour government. The introduction of a retirement age, a participation requirement.
A retirement age for the House of Lords.
For the House of Lords, sorry, yes. Consultation on long-term Lords reform, which is one of those perennially thorny topics that Meg was talking about. And then some sort of slightly broader comments that indicate a kind of ambitions for change in particular areas. So a modernisation committee to look at potential changes in the House of Commons in a range of different areas. That, of course, is borrowing the name of the modernisation committee that existed under the last Labour government, and a new standards body. So there was a sort of an overall ambition to do things differently and to introduce constitutional reform. What's less clear to me is that it's a very joined-up programme. I think it's potentially a little bitty, and that's something that we might come on to talk about.
I think one of the interesting questions, which Lisa has already alluded to, is the extent to which these are sort of real principled commitments to change, and the extent to which there's handy political devices to beat your opponents with. So in some of these areas, we heard quite a lot of complaints when Labour was in opposition and when they just entered power about, as Lisa says, wanting to change everything. And yet in some of the areas where things could most easily be changed, we've seen rather little change. So some of the things that you've mentioned, we have got a bill on, there's a bill in Parliament on the House of Lords to get rid of the hereditary peers. There's been a white paper on devolution in England, for example. But then some of the changes, which maybe you want to say more about in a moment, in terms of ministerial standards, for example, would have been very easy to change, but we've seen very little movement so far. So the report, I think, is not a menu of what the Labour government wants to do. It's a menu of all the things it might come under pressure to do, some of which it has very clear intentions to act upon, and others of which people outside government would quite like it to do. And I think in that latter category, there are those things that it might be persuaded to do, and there are those things that it's very unlikely to be persuaded to do as well. But we're trying to provide an overview of everything on, as we call it, the constitutional landscape, the constitutional agenda of people inside and outside government.
Yes, let's then go in a bit more depth into some of these areas. And Meg just mentioned standards, so standards of conduct, standards of behaviour from those in public life. And Lisa, a number of parts of the report to explore what might happen in the standards area. Do you want to dig into that a little bit further?
Yes. Well, standards has obviously been one of the areas of the Constitution that quite regularly finds itself on the front pages of newspapers. And what's happened over the last few years, I think, is that some of the gaps in the existing standard system have been exposed. So the standard system as it currently exists is fairly sort of bitty. It's developed piecemeal over time. And the result has been a range of different bodies with a range of different powers and a range of different statuses. So some of them have their existence put into legislation, various others don't, which means that in theory they could be abolished very quickly and easily if a Prime Minister ever decided to do so. And there's been quite a lot of work in recent years by bodies like the Constitution Unit and the Institute for Government and the UK Governance Project and various others, and parliamentary committees to try and think about how you might harmonise and strengthen that landscape. So how would you make sure that all of the various regulators that oversee, particularly ministerial standards, because ministers and MPs operate under slightly different systems, how all those different regulators have the powers to act effectively. And the thing that's really difficult about this in the UK Constitution, though, is one of these sort of fundamental underlying tensions that when you're talking about standards as they relate to elected politicians, there is a very difficult question of how far those should be enforced by unelected individuals, i.e. regulators, and how far by politicians' peers who have the same kind of democratic mandate, but may of course have other reasons such as party loyalty or opposition to make individual decisions in any one case.
Or of course, but by voters themselves. And so it's sometimes
Indeed.
said that, well, the sanction comes in an election after a 5-year period and voters have the chance to...
Or indeed sometimes with a recall election between elections these days. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Yes. So, yes, but Lisa, you were thinking particularly about reforms that might be made to the regulators, the watchdogs, in order to potentially firm up their role.
Yes. So the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which is the body that's kind of looks across the entire standards landscape, across the whole public sector, to think about how high standards can be maintained and enforced, did some work on this a little while ago and came up with a sort of a menu of criteria that you can use to work out whether a regulator has the powers it needs or not. And those include various of the things I already talked about, the statutory basis, having adequate resources. It's very hard to conduct effective investigations if you don't have any staff or money. Things like, are regulators independently appointed? And do they have the power to start their own investigations, to publish their findings, to recommend sanctions? And so you can use those as a sort of framework for looking at how regulators might need to be strengthened. And there are a couple that tend to come up repeatedly in these analyses as needing particular work. So the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Standards, who is essentially the Prime Minister's advisor in cases where ministers have been accused of breaching the ministerial code. The Independent Advisor's job is to go away, gather the facts, establish the evidence, and advise the Prime Minister on whether the code has been broken and what they should or shouldn't do about it. The ultimate decision does rest with the Prime Minister, but this person has a really important advisory role. That's a role that isn't in statute. It's often appointed through a very, very informal process. Previous holders have talked about it as being a tap on the shoulder. And the powers are relatively limited. The independent advisor has just been given the power to start their own investigations without needing the PM's permission. That's a relatively recent innovation.
So that's an innovation since the election, is that right?
Yes, it is.
That is something that the current government has done since it came to power.
Yes, so that is something that they promised in the manifesto and has been done since they came to power. Mm-hmm. But there are various other powers that person could still be given. And the statutory basis spans various of the regulators, so the independent advisor, the Commissioner for Public Appointments, who oversees the public appointments process to try and ensure that people who are being brought into public bodies are appointed fairly and transparently and openly, and also the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, which is a bit of a mouthful, sometimes called either ACOBA or ACOBA, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that's a body which tries to prevent a revolving door, essentially, between government and lobbying. So it applies rules for ministers or the most senior civil servants on leaving office to do with what employment they can and cannot take up. But that is a body, again, that doesn't have a statutory basis, and its enforcement powers are really limited to the ability to publish a critical report on its website. There's been quite a lot of work done on how that might be strengthened. It's an area that the Labour government promised in its manifesto to look at, but as yet they haven't come to any conclusions.
Yes, I guess I'm wondering how much of an open door are these sorts of proposals pushing at? And you've already mentioned that the government has acted in giving somewhat greater powers to the independent advisor on ministerial standards. They've also changed the name and the title of that role since the election. Can we expect more activity in this area?
I think the government certainly came to power with good intentions in this area. I think it's been a little surprising to various people that they haven't gone a bit further already. I think there's one big question about their policy in this area, which is that both the manifesto and Angela Rayner in a couple of speeches pre-election promised to set up a new standards body, an independent ethics and integrity commission. There's a very obvious question about how that body should relate to the regulators that currently exist, whether it's intended to subsume some of them, which I think was the sort of initial thinking, and that seems to have been rowed back on, whether it's a sort of umbrella body, whether it's seeking to play a coordinating role.
But we just haven't heard
anything. And it seems potentially that some of this, the rest of this standards agenda has sort of been parked until a decision is made on that.
I think sometimes it's hard to know to what extent you are pushing at an open door, because although the government is open in many respects, it doesn't tell us everything that it's planning. You don't know whether they're going to pull something out and have a big speech tomorrow on their determination to change standards. But I think that one of the things that this report is trying to do is kind of just set out the agenda so that people know what other things they might be knocking on that door with, and what expert bodies have said the government ought to be doing, so that they can keep reminding ministers maybe, well, what about this? The CSPL you referred to, Committee on Standards in Public Life, they called for this and you said you were going to do it, so when are you going to do it? That kind of thing. And that applies across several of these areas, I think.
So moving on to your area, Meg, you are the expert on Parliament.
There are others.
I can't imagine who. What would you want to highlight from the report's chapter on Parliament?
Well, the chapter on Parliament has, I think, 6 different sections, and 2 of them relate to legislation, and then there's one on Commons procedural reform, and there's a couple on the House of Lords, and one on standards, which Lisa's already spoken about quite a lot in the context of government. I said before that during those difficult sort of Brexit, COVID, Johnson years, there were quite a lot of concerns about decline in legislative standards, that legislation was being rushed through without adequate scrutiny, that procedures such as evidence taking were being sidelined, this kind of thing, and also that the government was increasingly putting important policies into what's called delegated legislation, which is legislation where ostensibly Parliament has given government permission to act, permission to change the law with only limited subsequent parliamentary scrutiny. And the feeling has been that that's getting broader and broader and the government is trying to do too much under delegated legislation. So there's a chapter on improving the delegated legislation process, where there have been a series of recommendations, particularly from the Hansard Society, but also parliamentary committees. There's a chapter on the primary legislative process and how that can be improved, and there have been lots of calls for changes in terms of more time being provided for legislation, better evidence taking, etc. Then there's broader reform of House of Commons procedures, where Lisa already mentioned, or perhaps you did, Alan, that the Labour Party put in its manifesto the establishment of a modernisation committee, which has subsequently been set up. And we're not still quite clear what its agenda is, but there are various areas going beyond those sort of legislative points. One of the questions over recent years has been about the control of time in the House of Commons, whether backbenchers have enough control, and whether in this Parliament, where the official opposition, the Conservatives, have an unusually small number of seats, and the third party, the Liberal Democrats, have an unusually large number of seats, whether actually we need to rethink how we're dividing up time between the opposition parties as well as between the government and non-government actors in the House of Commons. So we talk about that. And then the chapters on Lords reform are broken into 2 because the Labour manifesto was fairly explicitly broken into 2, and that is how Lords reform is, really. There's always the question of the little things that you could do potentially quite quickly to change things slightly, to just make little improvements. So improving the appointments process, putting restrictions on the size of the chamber, making sure that people who get in there are of adequate quality, maybe encouraging people to retire, as well as the removal of the hereditary peers. So there's a chapter on all of that, and there were a lot of promises in the manifesto there. The only one that we're seeing any progress on really at the moment is removal of hereditary peers, although the bill is being debated in the Lords at the moment, and there's lots of discussion of those other issues. Should there be a size limit? Should the appointments process be tightened up? Should people be required to leave if they're not adequately participating? Various things there. And then there's the question of longer-term, larger-scale reform, where some listeners might remember that there was a commission chaired by the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown a few years ago, which reported to Keir Starmer. A lot of that was about devolution, but connected to that was the idea of having a second chamber of the nations and regions, which would be an elected body on a totally different model to the current House of Lords. There's some allusion to that in the manifesto, but it's very much sort of long-term. We're going to consult, we're going to think about it. There are questions whether you might, for example, have a citizens' assembly to ask the public what they think about what the long-term future of the Lords ought to be. But that's definitely one of the more contested areas. There's a lot of small-scale stuff that you could do about Parliament, and there are indications the government wants to act, but also it's been a little bit slow to act in some of these areas, perhaps compared to what it said it would do. So perhaps the report will help people to keep up pressure on those areas a bit.
Yes, and if listeners want to go into even more detail on the subject of Lords reform, then we did a podcast episode a couple of years ago, like when you had a report out exploring the landscape on Lords reform in particular, and just setting out the various issues there.
House of Lords reform, it's a job for life.
Well, it has been on the agenda. Well, you would probably say going back to the 19th century. 1911 is the date that's always in my brain, because that's the date when in legislation it was said that there will be further Lords reform, and still more than a century later.
Well over 100 years ago. The thing that I always say is that the first bill attempting to limit the number of appointments to the House of Lords was in 1719. More than 300 years ago. So it's House of Lords reform is a job for many lifetimes, not just one.
And that's a reform that you're still pushing for.
Indeed.
And that still has not happened. Gosh, well, let us see if this government manages to change that record. I should probably say a bit about some of the reports that are in my domain, some of the bits of the report that are in my domain as well. So I focus mainly on elections in my work, and as Lisa said earlier on, there are some quite significant proposals in the government's manifesto in relation to elections. I guess the biggest one perhaps is on votes at 16, so it's very clear that the government wants to follow what's already happened in Scotland and Wales and reduce the age of enfranchisement from 18 down to 16. And I think there's broad agreement, certainly not universal agreement among experts, but broad agreement that is quite a sensible thing. There's certainly evidence that it would, over the long term, tend to increase turnout at elections, but only if it's done really well. And I think this is the crucial thing for us to be looking at over the next year or two. That effect on turnout works if you really put effort into education, citizenship education in schools, enabling people to understand their role in the democratic system and how they can vote effectively in order to have their voice heard. The government at the moment is conducting a review of the curriculum in England. There have been reviews in Scotland and Wales in recent years as well. So it'd be very interesting to see if the government picks up this point that doing votes at 16 crucially has to be accompanied by curriculum reform and work around education in order to ensure that reform works well. Another thing that Labour has said that it will pursue is making it easier for people to register to vote and then also actually to vote. And again, there are various experiments going in Wales and Scotland, different parts of the country, thinking about how we can make the process of registering to vote easier and make it a bit more automatic, so that if you're registering for other government services, then you can automatically or fairly automatically register to vote at the same time. And in terms of making it easier to vote, then I guess many people will be concerned about the voter ID requirements that were introduced by the previous government. So people voting at polling stations now have to show photographic ID, which they didn't have to do in the past. And it's clear that that has had some effect in reducing turnout in elections since that was introduced. It's also clear that the Labour government isn't going to remove that requirement, but they do look like they want to make it a bit easier to extend the list of forms of ID that is acceptable, and be very interesting there to see if they move in the direction of a digital form of ID, and whether that kind of starts to morph into a sort of digital ID card for other purposes as well, and just where that takes us in the debates around these issues. And then the third area where the government has said that it wants to act in terms of elections is in clamping down on foreign donations. So it's not allowed for people who are not on the UK electoral register to donate to political parties. But it is possible for such people to do so through, if they channel money through UK-based companies. And that essentially at the moment is an avenue that is ripe for exploitation. And the government is clear that it wants to clamp down on that at least a bit. Again, quite how far it wants to go isn't terribly clear at the moment. And I guess from my point of view, it's not obvious why anyone, wherever they're from, should be able to donate some vast sum of money to a political party, given the principle of everyone being equal in the democratic system. And it seems that the government doesn't want to move in the direction of having donation caps, so caps on how much people can donate to political parties. That was an issue that was quite live on the agenda some years ago, but has tended to move off the agenda more recently. So it'd be interesting to see just how far they're willing to go in that area. Then I guess just finally I might mention, again, many people will be concerned with the core of the electoral system, the first past the post electoral system. We had an exceptionally disproportional election result just a few months ago, and if the political party system is fragmenting increasingly, then the argument for first past the post, that it delivers stable single-party governments, may increasingly in the future be difficult to sustain. But on the other hand, at least for now, we have a stable government, a stable single-party government that has been produced by that electoral system, and there's clearly no chance that this government is going to pursue electoral reform. And then, I guess just finally, Meg mentioned the idea of maybe there being a citizens' assembly in relation to Lords reform. And the whole question of how the government can potentially open up the democratic system and enable more effective democratic participation, I think, is a really live one. There was certainly some interest in senior parts of the Labour Party in using citizens' assemblies before the election. We haven't really heard terribly much on that since the election. But again, there are lots of interesting ideas out there for how they could be used and how a range of other processes could be used to try to get people involved and enable people just to feel heard, feel part of the democratic process, which at the moment very few people do. So yeah, there's a little sense of some of the bits of the report that I have particularly focused on. Our time is always far too short, and we're coming to the end. Let me just ask one final question to each of you, Lisa and Meg. What is your message that you would want to give to policymakers, to ministers, coming out of this report? What's the main thing that you would want them to hear and go away with and think about further? Lisa?
I think the main thing that I would want people to take away from the report is the wealth of work that already exists on constitutional reform. I think there are lots of different areas in which people may have an interest and where people may think that the problems are easily identifiable. I think I'd say to those people, don't feel you have to start with a blank slate. There's an awful lot of work that's been done by parliamentary committees, by different specialist bodies, across a huge range of areas. And one thing that I really hope the report does is to spotlight some of that work and give people a guide to where they might go looking if they want to find out more about any of these topics, or if they want to think about what concrete policy solutions they might want to espouse.
Meg?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. And I would say some of these changes we've already referred to could be achieved relatively easily. I mean, I think there are two dimensions to that. One is where there's a high level of agreement. You're not going to get into sort of intractable long arguments about things. But actually some of these changes could be achieved without even legislating. Some of them are about the Prime Minister just saying that things are going to be different. You don't need to legislate, for example, to hold a citizens' assembly. You didn't refer to the section on political discourse, Alan. That's not necessarily about legislating for different discourse. It's about having a determination for discourse to be different. The section on devolution in the report hasn't got much attention during our discussion. You know, there are some things culturally there about just the different institutions at Westminster and in the devolved areas dealing with each other differently, respecting each other more. There are things that you can achieve quite easily if you've got a determination to do it. And then there are other things that are fairly intractable. Maybe they do need legislation, and crucially, if people are at loggerheads about them. Independence for Scotland, changing the electoral system, maybe even long-term Lords reform go in those categories. So, be aware, we're trying to indicate in this report where there's a relatively consensual set of experts and politicians, and where you might be able to make progress quite easily, and others where you may get into trouble if you rush into them too quickly.
And I guess I would just add to those points that these things really matter, that the health of the democratic system is incredibly important for all of us. And maybe we're seeing in various places around the world just at the moment the dangers that arise if you don't adequately protect and preserve and cherish your checks and balances within your system and the quality of democratic discourse, as Meg has just been saying, in the system. So these are not kind of second-order issues that politicians might think are unimportant relative to the issues around kind of delivery of public services and all these matters. Actually, the health of the democratic process is central to the delivery of the outcomes from government that the public want, and it's really essential to be thinking about these matters. So, thank you so much, Meg and Lisa, for that conversation. At this point, I normally reflect on how much I've learnt from the fascinating piece of research that we have been discussing, but I may be thought biased in this case, so perhaps I should refrain from commenting. But I really hope that listeners have had their appetites whetted by this conversation and that they will want to go away and dig further into all of those 31 various bits of the Constitution that we have been talking about. We have been discussing a new report just published by the Constitution Unit called The Constitutional Landscape, Options for Reform. It's written by Lisa James, Patrick Thomas, our excellent fourth author who couldn't join us today, by me, Alan Rennick, and by Meg Russell. It's freely available to download from the Constitution Unit's website, and as ever, we'll put full details in the show notes for this episode. Next week we have a special episode celebrating our colleague Cathy Elliott's inaugural lecture as professor here in the UCL Department of Political Science. The topic will be Rewilding the University, so don't miss that. And to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.